And again, to bring you up to date on what's happening, NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, is conducting a recovery effort in the Atlantic Ocean off the Cape, and we are expecting further information from NASA at any time now. They had a scheduled 4 o'clock Eastern Time news conference. The President of the United States, who was brought up to date on the explosion of Challenger this morning, made an arrangement with the Congress to cancel tonight's scheduled State of the Union address. It's been rescheduled for next week now. The President will address the country in 1 hour, about 5 o'clock Eastern Time. We'll be bringing that to you live as events continue to develop in relation to this morning's national tragedy, the explosion of the space shuttle Challenger, apparently killing all 7 aboard. Challenger carried 6 trained astronauts into space and the 1 civilian New Hampshire schoolteacher Sharon Christa McAuliffe. CNN's Ron Israel has a report.
3, 2, 1, and liftoff.
7 Americans were on board when the Space Shuttle Challenger lifted off from the Kennedy Space Center. The crew members included 3 trained pilots, a laser expert, the second woman to fly in space, a Hughes aircraft engineer, and Christa McAuliffe, the woman who was to have been the first teacher in space. Challenger's pilot was 40-year-old Michael Smith. He flew missions in Vietnam and was awarded the Navy's Distinguished Flying Cross. He said flying was a dream he had since childhood.
You know, as far back as I can remember, all I ever wanted to do was fly. And when I was a young kid coming up, of course, the space program was just getting started, and my interest just naturally from the flying aspects went over to wanting to fly into space, and it's just something that I've wanted to do all my life. And I don't know how I got interested. I can't tell you. I just have always been interested in doing flying.
The flight was commanded by 46-year-old Francis Dick Scobee. The Challenger flight was going to be his second trip aboard the space shuttle. Scobee was a test pilot with the Air Force. He entered the space program in 1979, and he believed Christa McAuliffe would serve as an important role model for younger Americans.
The lasting part is going to be the idea that she puts in the head of both teachers and students to expect to be in space. In other words, their future, space is part of their future. They expect to live and work there. And if she can do that, she's doing a lot for mankind.
Mission Specialist Ellison Onizuka was a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force. He was a member of the crew of the Defense Department's first super-secret shuttle flight.
I think that there is a need for, what we did on the first mission, and I fully believe that it's something that this country needed, the rest of the free world needed it.
Dr. Judy Resnik was a biomedical engineer before joining the space program in 1978. She said Christa McAuliffe became a part of the team, even though she was not a trained astronaut.
She knows where we're going to be standing, how busy it's going to be, where she can help, where we need our space, and she has learned an awful lot and become a team member.
Payload specialist Gregory Jarvis was an electrical engineer who joined the program only 2 years ago. He talked about the space vehicle.
Well, it's been very satisfying because you are close to the space. You don't get to do the ultimate trip, but you're close enough to the program that you really feel like you're contributing, and you bring your friends in to see the spacecraft, and they look at it, and you say, gee, I wonder, maybe it is something special, because I spent all my life around it, so it becomes very mundane to me.
Finally, 36-year-old mission specialist Ronald McNair was a physicist. He became an astronaut in 1978 following work at the Hughes Research Laboratories. McNair planned to track Halley's Comet during the Challenger mission.
Probably everything we know about it we're going to learn during this trip. We're going to learn something about some of the gases and elements that the comet are composed of. What does that tell us? Well, that comet exists now the way it did at the creation, origin of the universe.
McNair was the second black astronaut to fly in space. Ron Israel, CNN.
In that interview, one couldn't help but notice the bold red letters of the logo, I should say, of NASA. You saw it there in the beige background there. And this agency will be speaking officially very shortly. We had told you that the briefing at 3:30 had been pushed back to 4. it's running a little bit late. That's certainly understandable. And when they are ready to give us the latest on this, of course, your network of record will bring it to you live. President Reagan, deeply shocked, concerned over today's tragedy, calling it traumatic for the nation, as well as for himself personally. He was interrupted during a briefing for reporters on tonight's State of the Union address to learn the sad news. Shortly after seeing for himself in a videotape replay, Mr. Reagan wasted no time in revamping his schedule.
Due to the tragedy of Space Shuttle Mission 51L, the President, in consultation with the leadership of Congress, has decided to postpone the State of the Union address that was scheduled for this evening. He will address the Congress and the American people on next Tuesday.
That is the State of the Union address to come next week, but President Reagan will speak to the nation about an hour from now. We're told 5 o'clock Eastern Time, and that's about 54 minutes from now. And of course, CNN will carry it live. First Lady Nancy Reagan was watching the Challenger lift off on CNN. Her response after that explosion, "Oh my God, no." Mrs. Reagan's spokeswoman said the First Lady is in shock and grief for the families. House Speaker Tip O'Neill, among many in Congress, reacting to this tragedy.
Sometimes an event strikes us with such drama and surprise that it exceeds our ability to absorb it. This is what happened today in the terrible destruction of our country's space shuttle. The space shuttle carried on its side the flag of the United States, and those who served on her served us, the American people. They served our hopes for scientific exploration and for human progress, but they also served our dreams because they lived at the frontier of what mankind can achieve together.
And generally, the House of Representatives today put aside regular business to pay tribute to the 7 brave Americans.
With hearts heavy in trauma and deeply felt sorrow, the nation today pays honor and tribute to these brave young Americans and extends its hand to their families, their loved ones, their comrades, in such small ways as we can.
We've come to accept these flights as being so routine, and yet it's so highly sophisticated, highly technological in nature, that any little thing can go wrong. Remind me again of how mysteriously, or God moves in mysterious ways, I guess from time to time to remind us of what mortal beings we really are.
And on the other side of the Capitol building, several senators took exception to questions about whether NASA was getting lax about safety.
I think everyone that's ever had any connection with the program has felt that someday there would be a loss in flight. We're dealing with tremendous powers and speeds. You're traveling in orbit at 5 miles a second and trying to get back into the atmosphere from that kind of speed. And so, are we going to be perfect forever? I guess the answer was proven this morning, that the answer to that is no.
Safety has always been foremost in their minds. And we woke up on Sunday morning after having canceled at 10 o'clock the night before to a perfect morning. It was beautiful, sunny, clear blue skies, perfect launch, and there was a lot of talk that rather irritated me. Well, NASA was overly cautious. And so, no, I don't think that's true at all.
And the House of Representatives says it will conduct an investigation of the accident when NASA finishes its own investigation. And my apology to the man you're about to see next. I introduced him as Lou Dobbs. It's really Lou Waters in Atlanta.
All right, Bernie, a banner was unfurled this morning at Concord High School. It read, "Concord is proud of Christa McAuliffe." But the party atmosphere turned to horror as students and teachers watched the shuttle Challenger disintegrate in a ball of flames. There was dead silence, then tears at Concord High School. A teacher turned off the television set the students were staring at. The stunned children were ushered into classrooms while the teachers called their parents. Then The school day was cut short at Concord High as the students made their way home, crying. Some were shaking. Dozens of balloons that were to be released when Christa McAuliffe broadcast her first class in space sit in storage. It was just back in July that a bubbly, enthusiastic Christa McAuliffe spoke with reporters after being chosen to be the first civilian in space.
The training will start in September.
Did you think that you were ever going to fail in any part of the testing?
No, that wasn't really part of the evaluation process. So even if I had gotten sick on it, I'd still be all right.
Were you surprised by any of the testing or anything? Did you think it was harder than...
The intensity of it, just lots and lots of things crammed into a week. I mean, we were just running from early in the morning till late at night.
Do you think that was part of the training or the testing?
Well, maybe, but I think they were also, they knew that we only had us for a short period of time, and they were just trying to cram in as much as possible so that we could really experience everything that we could in that short period of time.
Scott said today you were going to take one of his pet frogs along on the flight. Is that going to be one of the pieces of the cargo?
Yes, we're going to put that frog right on the shuttle.
This is Scott?
This is Scott.
Scott, does the frog have a name yet? Legal, the frog is going to go into space? That's part of the deal. Did NASA know about this?
I do have a personal compartment on board the shuttle. I can't take some things along with me. Not big enough for any of you, but...
Actually, have you seen the inside? You must have seen the inside of one of these things.
Yeah.
A personal compartment. How comfortable is it?
It's probably about this big and about that wide, so that you can bring some things that you know, like
personal effects?
Yeah. T-shirts that you're going to wear, or something for your family.
What kind of T-shirts you're going to wear?
Oh, I don't know. I'll have to get a good New Hampshire one.
Can you tell us about the camaraderie between you and the other 9 finalists?
Oh, it's just wonderful. It really is. I mean, we went through so much. All I can liken it to is having a small bunch of kisses.
Christa, finally, what's it like?
Where's Bitty Bob?
She's resting.
Oh, she's resting? Oh, who's with her? Oh.
Now it's 20 seconds. It's a long 20 seconds. Is this like a countdown?
She'll go now, start any minute. I don't know.
Dion, Christa is here with me now. She just got off the plane a while ago, and I know that you were chosen for this mission partly because of your disposition. You've been giggling since you got here. Tell me why, again, you've said it so many times, why is this so important to you, making this trip on the shuttle?
Well, it's important for a lot of reasons, but I think the most important thing is to humanize the space age to a point where everybody feels a part of it, and the students really connect with that. They're the wave of the future. They're the ones who are going to have to deal with the space stations and beyond, and I really hope and feel that it's part of the teaching profession to bring those new career opportunities. I know, it's wonderful.
Okay, all right, so how's it feel to be back in New Hampshire?
It feels great to be home. I am really delighted because I kept hearing about all of these wonderful things that people were doing while I was down in Washington, while I was down in Houston, and I couldn't share with that. You know, and Steve would tell me on the phone, and he'd say, you know, you got some letters, or, you know, people called, and I couldn't share with that, so I'm really glad I'm home.
How long are you going to be home for?
Well, hopefully I'll be home on and off for about a month, so I'll be able to spend some time in New Hampshire.
I've got to ask you, when did you find out? Did you find out just before the announcement, or?
Yeah, we did. We asked as a group, we requested that we find out prior to going into the room. It was a small room. There were a lot of press there. We've invested an awful lot of emotion in these last 2 weeks, and we really felt that we needed to find out and compose ourselves before walking into the room. So we did know before we walked in.
What were your feelings when you found out?
Well, it was rather funny when we were talking about what was happening at home, and I was saying something to the effect that, you know, well, you know, when I'm not home, and I said my husband really relies on cornflakes and milk because that's kind of his staple. And Ann Bradley turned around and kind of, without missing a beat, she turned around and she said to me while the whole group was together, she said, I think you better buy some more cornflakes and milk.
Ed and Grace Corrigan, the parents of Christa McAuliffe, were at the Kennedy Space Center this morning. They knew television cameras were trained upon them, cameras that would capture their joy and jubilation over their daughter's flight into space. Instead, those cameras captured an almost painful grief and sorrow. It was another way last December when television cameras were trained on Ed and Grace Corrigan, who were obviously overjoyed and proud of their daughter's choice to be the first citizen in space.
What was it like when Christa was selected? How'd you all feel?
Great.
Excited. Very excited. You all going to be at the Cape?
Naturally, wouldn't miss it.
Yes, the whole family will be there. We have 4 other children besides Christa, so everybody will be there. Is this really like her? I mean,
Absolutely.
No change. This one at a time. Ms. Corcoran, did it surprise you first that she would try to be an astronaut and then be selected?
No on both. I know an awful lot of luck was involved in it, but I'm not surprised because I knew she'd do a good job if she were chosen, and I'm just so pleased that she was chosen.
What's she like growing up?
The same as she is as she comes over now. Exactly the same. She hasn't really changed.
But to people that don't know her and all they know is just what they've seen on TV, how would you describe your daughter, the teacher astronaut?
Oh, very caring, outgoing, excited, interested.
I would think, as father, this is just, I mean, you just got to be really proud.
Yes, absolutely proud.
What do you hope that she gets out of this, or is able to give others out of this? Mm-hmm. Is there something that she can pass on to others, or?
Well, I think that we hope the same as what she's hoping to bring back when she talks about demystifying space, and to come back and let all the other people know that it's not just scientists up there, that for the future everybody will be into space. And I think that's what she hopes to bring back to her children and to the teachers and to everybody in general.
How has she been just in talking to you all about the training and everything?
Totally excited. I mean, she never goes down low about anything. She's truly right with it all the time. She loves what she's doing. No complaints. But she's got that kind of a disposition anyway. She doesn't complain.
I imagine you all are looking forward to that point where she comes back and just tells you everything.
Yes, and to have her back, too.
Ed and Grace Corrigan, parents of Sharon Christa McAuliffe, who apparently died along with 6 astronauts in this morning's fireball over the Kennedy Space Center. As in any tragedy of this magnitude, especially for those intimate in the space program, it will be some time before we know the outcome of the investigation, future space shuttle plans. I know from covering the first 5 shuttle missions at the Houston Space Center that the astronauts are part of a family. This morning, even we hard-bitten journalists, newsmen, if you will, upon seeing this space shuttle explode, were shocked. We were horrified, and you can imagine what the members of the shuttle family have to go through in Houston, at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, the Goddard Space Flight Center, and all the rest. They're going to have to evaluate their emotions. They're going to have to go through this process before we can ever get their reactions about the future of the space program. But we do know that there apparently is going to be some considerable delay in the space program. Now that this tragedy has happened, there will have to be an investigation until the results of that investigation are complete. I'm sure you will be seeing no more space flights. That also is being debated in Washington, Bernie. We heard some, especially Charles Gray, the representative from Illinois, early this afternoon, saying that perhaps we should even go so far as to look into the future of the manned space flight program. So even Washington is in a state of stunned silence right now as far as where we are and where we're going.
Indeed, that is the case, Lou. As we've indicated, this afternoon, the anchors and reporters were at the White House, and we were there. All 4 major networks were invited to send in their anchormen and their White House correspondents. There must have been about 20 people around the luncheon table at the Roosevelt Room of the White House. The president was to come in, and then he was being briefed prior to coming in to talking to us, and then he learned about this tragedy from Vice President Bush and National Security Advisor John Poindexter, and then the president went to a study and he watched TV. Well, the Chief of Staff, Donald Reagan, and John Spahn and Admiral Poindexter continued briefing us on the President's State of the Union address as scheduled then at that point. And Mr. Reagan upon getting this information, decided, well, I will at least come in and say a few words to them. Well, obviously, when the president walked in, we were not interested in the State of the Union message. We wanted to know what the latest was he had and what he was thinking. And on the point you raised in coming to me about soul searching going on here in Washington, I asked the president specifically, Mr. President, are you afraid there will be any public backlash against the space program because of this tragedy? And the president said, quote, I shouldn't think so, and I would certainly do everything I could to express an opinion the other way. You know, we have accidents in every line of transportation, and we don't do away with those things. They've probably got a better safety record than we have out on the highways. No, I apologize to you, I'm misreporting. That was not my question. I thought that was. I'll find it in a second. But there is soul searching going on. I can tell you, I did ask the president about accidents, and he said, in effect, I said, Mr. Reagan, will the space program be dead until we find out absolutely what went wrong? And the president said, quote, there will not be a flight until they're absolutely certain that it is safe. And he went on to indicate that obviously NASA wants the same thing, to find out exactly what happened. Lou, in covering this kind of story, our viewers, you've been with us since, well, since the liftoff this morning until you saw what happened 18 miles into space. It's very difficult because this story is unfolding. We know that 7 Americans will never return, but what we're trying to do, we're assuming that perhaps you're just joining us for the first time, so we want to bring you up to date on what has happened, and we want to tell you what we expect to happen. And sometimes there are miscues, but we're endeavoring to bring it to you as quickly as possible. It's not always neat, but you know it's factual and it's accurate. You heard from our Moscow Bureau Chief, Stuart Lurie, who told us what the Soviets have said, how they're reacting initially, and they're reporting to the Soviet citizens in rather somber tones. We heard from our overseas correspondent, Richard Blystone in London, who indicated that some of the pilots from England who were due to arrive in the United States next week to begin shuttle preparation, they send their condolences. So we're trying to get that to you as quickly as possible. And Lou, we're going to have President Reagan up shortly at 5 o'clock Eastern Time. We also were expecting the NASA briefing. Now we're told it's coming up in 8 minutes. Originally it was 3:30 Eastern Time, moved back to 4 o'clock, and now it's beginning to go somewhat. Certainly all of this very understandable. We cannot report the news to you until it occurs. And when they are ready to come up, we will be carrying it live for you. Lou, on a story like this that's so tragic, it's very difficult to conceal your emotions and still do your job professionally. And of course, that's minor on a scale of 1 to 10 compared to the tragedy being felt by the people who've lost their lives, their families, their friends, people who've known them.
And Bernie, there certainly is a lot of emotion that we will be seeing in relation to this story before we're through reporting it, as CNN's continuing live coverage goes on into the night and into tomorrow for many days and weeks to come. Again, the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded in a massive ball of fire 72 seconds after blastoff Tuesday. As it hurtled into the Atlantic Ocean, there appeared no chance that teacher Christa, McAuliffe, and the 6 astronauts on board survived. CNN science correspondent Tom Mintier is with us to provide some background. Tom.
Lou, we might want to take a look at our slow motion that recorded the instant that the fire developed on board Challenger, at the base of Challenger, between Challenger and the external tank. Here you see the fire in slow motion between the shuttle and the external tank that has liquid hydrogen in it. That might be indicative, and NASA, I'm sure, will be studying this very closely along with the data that was coming in, because they have, you know, hundreds and hundreds of subsystems that monitor performance of the engines, the external tank, the solid rockets. They monitor everything. Now, along the edge of the external tank, this is a book that's put out by Martin Marietta, one of the contractors for the Space Shuttle program. This shows the connection points. There are 2 connection points on the external tank that connect the shuttle's engine, which derive their fuel from this. And one of those points is on the aft of the shuttle, where these feeder tubes come up. And they run along, I don't know if you can see, there's a small little line here, a small tubing that provide liquid hydrogen for the shuttle's engines to power them. That is the point, approximately, where we could see the flames before the explosion. There were two flames on this solid, or this external tank, a flame here and a flame on this side. And when you compare it with the slow motion that we just showed you a second ago, it is approximately near that feeder valve point that feeds into the shuttle and powers the engines. It's going to be a while before they really understand what happened. Workers at Rockwell International in California built the Space Shuttle Challenger, and many were watching television today when their handiwork exploded in midair. The company spokesman says he doesn't know what caused the explosion, and he promised to have a formal statement on the tragedy later. The space program had a perfect in-flight safety record until today, and as CNN's Burton Jones reports, there were backup plans in case of a disaster.
For years, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration has had in place emergency procedures to deal with almost every contingency. Almost every contingency. Rescue crews and astronauts alike all train for the possibility of space accidents, emergency landings, and fiery crashes. There is no drill to cover a shuttle blowing up just after launch. But the emergency procedure to keep a shuttlecraft from crashing into a populated area calls for the deliberate destruction of the ship right after liftoff. The shuttle is built like a bomb. The solid fuel rocket boosters and large external fuel tank are wired with special radio receivers and high explosives. When they are triggered, the resulting fireball vaporizes the shuttle and its crew. This nation's 19 space shuttle missions have logged more than 50 million miles without injury. U.S. Senator Jake Garn, a former astronaut, was asked about critics who charged that launch procedures for Tuesday's tragic flight had been rushed.
No, I was down on Saturday and for the launch on Sunday morning, and they were criticized on Sunday for being overly careful. Safety has always been foremost in their minds.
And liftoff of the orbiter.
Senator Garn said he would feel safer on a shuttle flight than driving his own car. Burton Jones, CNN.
Joining us now in New York, David Halfin. He is a professor of astrophysics at Columbia University. Professor, we may have to interrupt this interview at any time. We're awaiting NASA briefing in about 3 or 4 minutes or so, but that's been delayed all along. Tell us, there's been talk on the floor of the House of Representatives and with other people we've talked with since the tragedy this morning, what you think this tragedy might mean for the future of the space program.
Well, as Ms. McAuliffe said in the news you just reported, she wanted to demystify space. This was for NASA to be the year in which they had their most ambitious space science program, the launch of a probe to Jupiter, the launch of the Space Telescope, which will allow us to see to the edge of the universe, the launch of a mission in just 6 weeks to study Halley's Comet. And it appears that all of this at least is on hold and certainly is severely jeopardized by this accident today.
Well, you mentioned Halley's Comet. Now, the comet won't wait, of course, so what are we missing?
Well,
what kind of setback for people like you?
The Soviets and the Japanese have all sent spacecraft to rendezvous with Comet Halley. We had a whole complement of instruments ready to go on the space shuttle on March 6th to observe the comet during the rendezvous with those spacecraft. In fact, they were feeding back, giving them information where the nucleus of the comet would be so they could make final corrections. I doubt very much that will go, and Comet Halley.
King's Inn Motel, located on Route 15 in South Williamsport, where you can enjoy the finest in elegant dining in the St. Regis Room, featuring American and continental cuisine. The Emerald Lounge...
A comment by other governments?
Oh, yes, we have participated in some sense in those programs, and most of science at this level is international, but still their missions will be substantially less productive now.
That takes care of Halley's Comet now, but this was the second of what was to be a scheduled 15 missions.
That's correct.
For this year. Give us some idea in terms of medical, scientific, military, if you can get into anything in the military.
Well, that I don't know much about. I know there were several military shuttles this year. I imagine they would receive top priority, meaning that the science missions, the mission to Jupiter, the Space Telescope, will probably be delayed even further. the mission to Jupiter, and another one, which is a joint European-American effort to launch a satellite over the North Pole of the Sun to study the solar wind and its potential effect on the Earth. Both have a launch window of only 10 days in May. They must go within that 10 days or they're automatically
Okay,
delayed
Professor, to interrupt you, NASA finally has a long-awaited news briefing going on right now. We're going to join it in progress.
It is with deep, heartfelt sorrow that I address you here this afternoon. At 11:40 a.m. this morning, space program experienced a national tragedy with the explosion of the Space Shuttle Challenger approximately a minute and a half after launch from here at the Kennedy Space Center. I regret that I have to report that based on very preliminary searches of the ocean where the Challenger impacted this morning, these searches have not revealed any evidence that the crew of Challenger survived. The dedicated crew members of Challenger are Commander Francis Dick Scobee, pilot Michael J. Smith, mission specialist Dr. Judy Resnik, Ellison Onizuka, and Dr. Ronald McNair. And payload specialists on board were Christa McAuliffe and B.Jarvis. All early indications in the Launch Control Center, the Kennedy Space Center, have indicated that the launch was normal up to approximately 11:40 a.m. this morning, about a minute or so into the flight. Flight controllers in the Launch Control Center here and in the Mission Control Center in Houston were polled immediately after the explosion, reported that they did not see anything unusual up to that point. The solid rocket booster recovery ships were immediately dispatched to the area approximately 18 or so miles downrange from Kennedy, along with various Coast Guard and military ships, helicopters, and planes. I have taken an immediate action to form an interim investigating board to implement early activities in this tragedy. Data from all of the shuttle instrumentation, photographs, launch pad systems, hardware, cargo, ground support systems, and even notes made by any member of the launch team and flight ops team are being impounded for study. A formal board will be established by the acting administrator very, very shortly. Subsequent reports on this tragedy will be made by this formal review board. I am aware and have seen the media is showing footage of the launch today from the NASA Select system. We will not speculate as to the specific cause of the explosion based on that footage. It will take all the data, careful review of that data, before we can draw any conclusions on this national tragedy. Thank you.
Mr. Moore has time for just a couple of questions from each center before returning to the effort in investigating this tragedy. Please wait for the microphone and give your name and your affiliation. And we'll start right here with Jacqueline Bolden from Channel 6.
There were some reports that the shuttle perhaps rose a little slower than in previous launches, and there seemed to be a loud noise, and then the noise kind of backed off, and then a rush of noise again. Did you get any reports from anyone else that this seemed different from the people who either experienced it, saw it here live?
I have not heard any reports at all relative to that effect that you just described. None whatsoever.
Okay. Up here in the third row, Michael.
My name's Kevin Hamilton from WGIR in Manchester. The entire Teacher in Space program was designed to introduce more people, specifically youngsters, to the space program. This obviously is not the introduction you intended to make. What do you think the effect, the long-term impact that this is going to have on the youngsters that you were hoping to attract?
Well, I think we'll have to address that as time goes on. And again, I think today, the events of the day makes it much too early for me to speculate on the long-term impacts.
Okay, Al Selstead from Baltimore Sun in the first row.
Mr. Moore, at this time, do you have any estimate of how much liquid fuel was in the external tank at the time of the explosion, and how much explosive power, say in terms of TNT, that remaining liquid fuel might have been equal to?
No, sir, not at this time. You realize what we've been doing since 11:40 this morning is we immediately pulled our senior management together in this program, and I formed an interim board to ensure that all relevant data to this event would be impounded and would be made accessible to the investigative people that will go and take a look at it. I can't answer your specific questions relative to how much fuel was on board at this point in time. The board, when it's formally reported by the administrator, formally formed by the acting administrator, I'm sure will go into those kinds of questions, but I can't answer it right now.
Okay, we're going to take one more question here before going to the Johnson Space Center for questions. Here in the right opposite you, Jackie.
Peter Van Sant from CBS News. We received a call today from a member of an academic group who said he was on a tour group that was at the Pad 39B on Saturday night. This group was supposed to get off the bus to take a close look at the shuttle, but was not allowed to because this caller says they were told that a derrick arm had struck one of the tanks on the shuttle and that some repair work was being done. Are you aware of this incident, and are you aware of any problems at all with any of with either the external tank or the two solid rocket boosters?
No, we looked at that on Saturday. There was not even in the same area that of the tank. It was a small box, a heater box that had about a quarter of an inch of the insulation out of 5 inches that was scraped. It was a very minor scrape. It was repaired, and everybody, all the experts in the program, took a look at that, and so we closed it off at that point in time.
Wait for the microphone. I have to have the microphone.
There was no damage to any tank, or this arm did not strike any tank as far as
Not to my knowledge.
Okay, we're going to the Johnson Space Center for questions. Just a couple of questions.
This is the Johnson Space Center. We have a question from Paul Reeser, Associated Press.
Yes, Mr. Moore. Was there any debris of any description recovered by the vessels, and if so, what was it?
We do not have any detailed debris reports at this point in time. That certainly is something that we're looking at, and we will be impounding all the debris that we recover, and we've set up plans here to store that debris so that the investigating group can go in and look at that and assess that in great detail. I do not have any detailed reports right now on debris.
Okay. Bruce Nichols.
Mr. Moore, with all the delays that you experienced last week, the delay again this week, was there any pressure building at all to try to get this one off the ground? Was the pressure up there? And who made the final decision to go or no go?
There was absolutely no pressure to get this particular launch off. We have always maintained that flight safety is our top priority consideration in the program, and we look at the status and readiness of the systems based on that. We thoroughly reviewed the activities over the weekend and yesterday, and continually reviewed the status of Challenger right up until launch this morning. All of the people involved in this program, to my knowledge, felt that Challenger was quite ready to go, and I made the decision, along with the recommendation from the team supporting me, that we launch.
We're going to the Marshall Space Flight Center for a couple of questions.
Martin Berkey with Huntsville Times. Can you tell me what this does to the schedule on down the line, including the launch at Vandenberg?
No, I'm not prepared to do that. What I have done is basically suspend operations for a few days till we can sit down and assess this. And you know, we're obviously not going to pick up any flight activity until we fully understand what the circumstances were relative to this morning's launch. So in the interim, near-term time, we basically suspended operations until we get a handle on what our problems were this morning.
Nick Miller, WAFF Television in Huntsville. What part will Marshall Space Flight Center play in the investigation, since the propulsion system was the responsibility of the Space Flight Center here?
Well, they obviously have to play a very strong role in the investigating what happened this morning. As you know, the Space Shuttle program is built around a team effort, not only involving the Marshall Center, but also the Kennedy Space Center and the Johnson Space Center. All of the elements have different responsibilities, and clearly Marshall has the propulsive responsibilities on the shuttle. They will play a very dominant role, as will the other three centers I mentioned, as well as anybody that is contributing to the overall program and has some relevant information to add will certainly play a part.
Okay, we're moving to Washington for questions from NASA headquarters. Okay, there is a problem with our audio circuits to Washington. We are going to the Jet Propulsion Laboratory in Pasadena.
Bill Hines of the Chicago Sun-Times. Mr. Moore, in your opening remarks, you mentioned the appointment of this interim review board and said that it would be making statements from time to time. Not to put any adverse interpretations on this, it sounds a little bit like a news blackout, and I'm wondering if your objective is to consolidate information, what will be the point of issue of all those announcements in the future? And are other people not involved in that review board forbidden to talk?
Well, let me
in that review board forbidden to talk.
Well, let me correct your statement. First of all, I said that I had appointed an interim review board. That interim review board is composed of the senior members of the NASA team here to take immediate actions on impounding data. The acting administrator is expected to appoint a formal review board very shortly, and it will be left up to that review board in order to determine its progress reports in terms of their findings. What we have done here today is to move very quickly so that all relevant data could be impounded and all actions that are needed to be taken in order to preserve as much information as we can on the circumstances of this morning can be preserved. And that's the nature of the work that I've implemented today, and I expect a formal board to be established very, very shortly, within the next day or so, by the acting administrator.
This is Roy Neal, NBC News. Jess, you've said, I believe, that future flights are temporarily frozen. The United States space program, as a result, is at a halt. Now, based on your experience, how long would you estimate that this investigation will take? 6 months, a year, before you get back in business?
Roy, it is, as you know, it is very difficult to estimate that time. It's going to be a function of what the board finds were the difficulties today and what corrective actions have to be taken before we feel confident and feel safe to fly again. And I clearly am not in a position to speculate today the length of time involved in making that determination. It will be done just as quickly as we possibly can, but also as prudently as we possibly can and as thoroughly as we possibly can.
One more question from JPL.
Bill Hines again. I've got to follow up on that first question of mine. I understand now that there will be announcements made after the permanent board is appointed. Is that correct?
There will be an announcement, I'm sure, of the members of the permanent board, yes. I believe that will be correct, and then I think that board will determine its rate of reporting based on the progress of its findings.
Okay, we're going next to the Washington NASA headquarters.
Are there any indications of sabotage or attack on the shuttle?
I'm sorry, we didn't read that question. And while they're repairing that circuit to Washington, we'll go to the Goddard Space Flight Center in Maryland.
Mark Weaver, WBAL Radio in Baltimore.
Has this raised any questions about how reliable the space shuttle is? Might there just be too many things that could go wrong with a vessel this complicated?
Well, that question, I'm sure, will be asked, and I don't want to speculate on that at this point in time. That's certainly a logical question for somebody to ask.
Ken Terrell from WDVM in Washington. Were there any unusual weather conditions aloft or any unusual weather conditions during the launch?
None that we observed that I recall. We did put up some weather balloons early this morning. We did look at load conditions as we normally do, and the winds aloft looked good. We didn't have any exceedances as far as our load indicators are concerned, to my knowledge, and we thought everything was in good shape for a launch this morning.
Mr. Moore, I.J. Hudson from WRC-TV. Has it become a problem that you have been too good in the past, that the American people have seen flawlessly perform missions on TV almost routinely, and that something like this happens all of a sudden, it hits home even harder?
Well, I don't know how to answer your question specifically. We always strive in every flight that we perform to be as reliable and as safe as we possibly can, and to do everything that we can to ensure that the vehicle and the systems are all ready to fly. Flight safety is our #1 priority in the Space Shuttle program. And certainly when you see an event like this morning, we are going to have to do a very detailed assessment of the set of circumstances to try to understand what occurred, and we will then in turn assess the impacts from that to determine where we go in the future.
I think you can hear it over the speaker.
Okay, back here at the Kennedy Space Center, we only have time for a couple more questions. Jay Barbary from NBC News in the front row here.
Jess, I would like to know if you know what happened to Challenger. Can we assume that it was consumed in the explosion? And can you tell us specifically what you know now that the recovery crew has recovered in the impact area?
I have not gotten a briefing, Jay, on what the recovery team has found at this point in time. And I have basically looked at the NASA select photos and so forth that you did, and all I can say is that it appeared from those photos that there was an explosion. And that's about all I can say at this point in time.
Okay, we have time for only one more question, and James Fisher from the Orlando Sentinel has had his hand up a long time.
Jess, I realize this is a rather forward-thinking question, but what is the situation with the Rockwell plant about the possibility for ordering another shuttle? Has the assembly line been shut down? What's the situation with that?
Well, as we've discussed in the past, we are manufacturing structural spares for an orbiter system, and that manufacturing process is continuing. We are also buying spares for the current fleet that we have, and there is a production capability there if and when it's decided that that's the next step we want to do, is to move forward and do that. So I think the bottom line answer to your question is yes, that is a possibility, that we could implement a production capability for another orbiter if that were decided to be the thing to do.
Okay, I'm sorry to have to wind this up now. Mr. Moore has to get back immediately. As you know, he's been here since very early in the morning, and there's much to be done. Thank you all.
Thank you.
All right, that's our briefing from the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Jess Moore, the Associate Administrator, telling us that at 11:40 a.m. Eastern Time this morning, about a minute and a half into its flight, and based on what NASA is seeing from photographs at this time, the Space Shuttle Challenger apparently exploded. No other evidence, he said, exists at this time, or at least he has not gotten any information from those helicopters and ships at the scene of any evidence of what may have caused that explosion. What evidence there is that there are no survivors among the 7 who are on board that flight, and they are Francis R. Dick Scobee, who is the spacecraft's commander. Commander Scobee was born May 19th, 1939 in Washington State, and he became a NASA astronaut in 1978. He had logged more than 6,500 hours in 45 types of aircraft. Scobee was pilot of STS-51-C, the space shuttle flight, in 1984. Judith Resnik was a Ph.D. and one of the 3 mission specialists aboard this Challenger flight this morning, Flight 51L. Judith Resnik was born April 5th, 1949 in Akron, Ohio. She received her B.S. degree in electrical engineering from Carnegie Mellon University and a Ph.D. in electrical engineering from the University of Maryland. She became an astronaut in 1978. The only civilian on board was Sharon Christa McAuliffe, a school teacher, the teacher in space participant. Christa McAuliffe was born September 2nd, 1948 in Boston. She received a B.A. degree from Framingham State College and a master's degree in education from Bowie State College in Bowie, Maryland. McAuliffe was selected as primary candidate for the NASA Teacher in Space project in July of 1985. Ellison S. Onizuka, a lieutenant colonel in the United States Air Force. He was a mission specialist aboard this morning's flight. He became an astronaut among that large class of astronauts in 1978. Colonel Onizuka was born June 24th, 1946 in Hawaii. He received B.S. and M.S. degrees in aerospace engineering from the University of Colorado. He became a NASA astronaut in 1978. Gregory B.Jarvis was a payload specialist. His specialty was lasers. Gregory Jarvis was born August 24th, 1944, Detroit, Michigan. He received a B.S. degree in electrical engineering from the State University of New York at Buffalo, an M.S. degree in electrical engineering from Northeastern University, Boston. And he had completed the coursework for an M.S. degree in management science at West Coast University in Los Angeles. Jarvis was selected as a payload specialist candidate in 1984. Ronald E. McNair, a Ph.D., also a mission specialist, became an astronaut in 1978. Ronald McNair was born October 21st, 1950 in Lake City, South Carolina, where he received a B.S. degree in physics from North Carolina A&T State University and a Ph.D. in physics from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Lastly, the pilot of the flight this morning, Michael J. Smith, a United States Navy pilot who was born August 30th, 1945 in Beaufort, North Carolina. He became a NASA astronaut in 1980. Smith received a B.S. degree in naval science from the U.S. Naval Academy and an M.S. degree in aeronautical engineering from the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School.
President Reagan called those 7 astronauts pioneers, and their death a horrible thing. He said he's shocked by this traumatic event. And as we've been reporting, he has postponed his 5th State of the Union address until a week from today. He will speak to the American public at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, which CNN will carry live. That's about, 7 minutes and 9 seconds from now. The President dispatched Vice President George Bush to the Kennedy Space Center at Cape Canaveral, Florida. Here, the Vice President is boarding his plane at Andrews Air Force Base. He's accompanied. The man in the raincoat, the light coat, is Senator John Glenn of Ohio, and in the dark blue suit, looking to the right there, was Senator Jake Garn. Both men, of course, having gone into space. First Lady Nancy Reagan, too, is in a state of shock. She's expressing her grief, especially for the families of this latest mission. Up on Capitol Hill, as elsewhere, the reaction went from stunned disbelief to reluctant acceptance. Many members said they wanted to make sure that those who died for the space program did not die in vain.
Man has the thirst for knowledge, we will continue to press outward. And in the process, there is risk. That risk is taken by each one of us every day, and that risk is understood by all the members of a crew that climb into a loaded spaceship.
We know that the men and women who have carried us on to the space frontier are people of great strength of character, who are willing to face the dangers involved in the space program so that our future and the future of our children and their children may be assured. The rewards to mankind and this nation that exist on that frontier are believed by each of them to be worth the risks.
We have grown to take for granted enormous technical events such as this, and we have grown to assume that nothing will ever happen, and we had hoped this one would never happen, but it did. I'm hopeful that it doesn't totally dampen our spirit and enthusiasm for experimental things and for outer space activities, because they are absolutely necessary.
This is a day of sadness that we will never forget. We will, however, Mr. Speaker, go on with our space program. We will pursue our dream to live and work in space, to push back the limits of our knowledge in the vast sea of space. But wherever we go, we will carry in our hearts the memory of those courageous men and women who died today so suddenly and so unexpectedly. God bless them and their families in this tragic hour.
And many congressmen expressed their confidence in the U.S. space program and hoped it would not be set back by today's tragedy. Again, President Reagan live addressing the nation in less than 5 minutes from now. Lou?
The parents of New Hampshire teacher Christa McAuliffe were in a VIP viewing stand at the Kennedy Space Center this morning. Their 37-year-old daughter had been picked from 11,000 teachers to be the first private citizen in space. There were shrieks of joy when the shuttle Challenger lifted off the launch pad. A minute later, the shrieks of joy turned to cries of horror when it became apparent the shuttle had exploded. Edward and Grace Corrigan, McAuliffe's parents, clutched each other in tears. NASA officials rushed to shield them from the crowd and led them away. Less than 2 minutes earlier, Challenger had lifted off from the launch pad on its 10th launch and the 25th for the Space Shuttle program. There was no clue to the disaster to follow. No American astronaut had ever been killed in flight, and it had been exactly 19 years and a day since the worst previous disaster in the nation's space program. That was when Virgil Gus Grissom, Edward White, and Roger Chaffee died in a fire aboard the first Apollo moonship while it was still on the launch pad. But 72 seconds after liftoff today, the shuttle exploded in a massive ball of flame. The debris fell into the Atlantic Ocean 18 miles southeast of the launch pad. Rescue ships and helicopters rushed immediately to the area, but there was nothing to indicate that any of the 7-member crew survived the blast. Again, we're expecting our coverage of the Challenger tragedy to continue with the President of the United States addressing us. We will have further information. Excuse me for a minute. Go ahead. All right. We have a report on Republican Senator Jake Garn of Utah, who flew, as you know, on a space shuttle mission last year. Garn noted that the shuttles had been modified not to include an escape mechanism, but he did say he did not think that would have made any difference in the tragedy this morning.
Columbia had been modified so that it did not have the escape mechanism in it. This is purely my opinion, but in watching what happened this morning, I would doubt very much, even if you had had an escape capsule on board or parachutes, that it would have been possible to get out with that kind of an explosion in any event.
Despite the tragedy, Senator Garn said the space program should continue, and he said he would fly again tomorrow if NASA would let him. Bernard Shaw in Washington.
And of course, basically the question put to Senator Garn was the one we'd alluded to earlier, and in trying to report it to you and trying to report to you what I asked the President of the United States only a few hours ago, I got lost in my own notes, but I did find what the President said. I'd like to read it to you because I think it's very significant on this question of safety. Mr. President, do you want to see all systems halted until we find out explicitly what happened in this tragedy? Well, I'm not a scientist, the President responded. I do have confidence in the people that have been running this program, and this is the first in what is 56-some flights that something of this kind has happened. I certainly want everything done that can be done to find out how this could have happened and to ensure against its happening again. And he concluded by saying, now we know they weren't, And so I'm confident that there will be no flight until there are absolutely, as certain as human beings can be, that it is safe to fly in space. The President was speaking for about 10 minutes in the Roosevelt Room, and then he went back into the Oval Office to get more information. The President was bleary-eyed this afternoon. His eyes were somewhat red as he spoke to us, and he stood at the end of the table in the Roosevelt Room, his hands clutching the back of the chair, and speaking very quietly, very sincerely. He entertained all the questions